a good friend of the program. It's been a while since we chatted. Webster Tarpley is an historian, a critic of American foreign policy, best known for his book, George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography. 1992, that came out. Tarpley was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1946. In 1966, he graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. He was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Turin, Italy, later teaching English at Cornell University. In 1970-1980, he appeared as a commentator for Teleradio Soleil, a television station in Rome. And from 1984 to 1996, he was 1996 rather. He was a correspondent let me get the dates right here. From 1984 to 1996, he was a correspondent in Washington. In 1997, he published an anthology entitled Against Oligarchy: Essays and Speeches, from 1970 to 1996. These books can be consulted on the internet at www.tarpley.net. His 9/11 Synthetic Terror is considered the Bible of the 9/11 Truth Movement. It sold over 20,000 copies. His two books on Obama are virtually the only critical ones in print from a progressive viewpoint. And most recently, he has published an e-book entitled Subverting Syria. Webster Tarpley, welcome once again to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Thank you very much, Richard. Subverting Syria is not really my book. I'm not sure where you got that. But what I did publish last year was one called Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, with polygamy, theocracy, and
my apologies.
Subversion.
I think that it was linked to a website that featured your books. My apologies. Okay. But we are here to talk about Syria.
Absolutely. And congratulations on your program and your network.
We're building it brick by brick. We're getting the word out there across America, Webster.
Great.
So let's back up. First of all, before we talk about this chemical attack, August 21st, let's talk about the Assad regime. What are your impressions? You've been to Syria.
Yes.
What are your impressions of Bashar al-Assad? Because I don't put him in he's a typical Middle Eastern ruler. He's a strong man, to be sure, but I don't put him in the same camp as a Gaddafi or one of these madmen. He seems to me to be a very rational, reasoned human being.
Richard, I would be very cautious with this madman stuff, because these terms are thrown around by Western leaders who are themselves open to question in terms of their sanity and their morality and so forth, right? We don't need to go much further than Bush the younger. I suppose we should go to Bush the elder. I've written about both of them. Gaddafi was somebody who built the largest water irrigation and drinking water project in the world, the Great Man-Made River. And I think one of the reasons for invading Libya was to get a hold of that water, which is a very valuable commodity in the Middle East. What you have are these regimes that were modeled on Nasser of Egypt. They were military, they were authoritarian, to be sure, but they were anti-imperialist. They tried to have economic development, and they also tried to have this element of price subsidies and putting a floor under the poorest people. So they had a strong element of economic populism. Now, Syria under Hafez Assad, the elder, had, I think, was a much different proposition than what you had today. This was a country that was very much a dictatorship. The other problem you have, though, is you see that some of these countries have a tragic dilemma between dictatorship and absolute civil war and chaos, and I think that's a question that cannot be easily answered, but it certainly shouldn't be dodged. Anyway, as of the death of Hafez Assad around 2000, you have his son, who I believe is indeed a reformer, not in the way that would satisfy a lot of people, but certainly a reformer in the sense that actually he's a figure very difficult to demonize, because he's very personable. He's rather unassuming in some ways, but speaks a lot of English, right? Lived in London, was an eye doctor in London, has this rather presentable wife and so forth. But the main thing is that there's an establishment there which refuses to follow the dictates of U.S. imperialism. And this was the main crime of Gaddafi, right? You don't hear anything about the monsters of Saudi Arabia or the monsters of Qatar or the monsters of Bahrain, right? And those are absolute monarchs with no semblance of elections or anything else. But somehow they're spared, right? None of them is a madman. None of them is a monster. But I think in reality, those really are the monsters. So what we're left with then is, by a couple of years ago, the conclusion of U.S. imperialism with the British and many other NATO forces thrown in was that the World Economic Depression, which began in 2008, meant that it was no longer possible to tolerate the existence of nation states. And the goal of the NATO and U.S. foreign policy since the Depression, but even earlier, and you can show this, has been to break up the existing nation states. They talk about mini-states, micro-states, rump states, failed states, secessionism, warlords, you name it. And you can see Sudan carved into two parts, Yugoslavia broken up, and then Serbia carved, Soviet Union carved, desire to carve the Russian Federation, Iraq de facto carved into three, plans to carve Iran and Pakistan into 4 or 5, whatever it is. The British are even willing to do it to themselves, right, with Scotland, in order to use that as a kind of a show window for this kind of thing, right? So secessionist movements everywhere. And the chosen vehicle for this, since you have all these young men who don't find jobs because of the Depression, it's easy to recruit them to fanatical Salafist preachers and other kinds of demagogues. You can recruit them to these marauding bands. It's kind of like this, the 30 Years' War in Europe, right? When an economic crisis means that you've got all these unemployed young guys running around with nothing to do. So what has happened is that the CIA, acting on the models that were pioneered by John Negroponte in Central America in the 1980s, then brought by Negroponte to Iraq in the previous decade, maybe 10 years ago. His disciple, Robert Ford, was the one who made sure that was delivered then into Syria. The death squads. In other words, I wouldn't call them rebels. I wouldn't call them insurrectionists. They are terrorists. They are death squads. They are people from al-qaeda, the Nusra Brigade, and so forth. Right?
I refer to them as insurgents. I refer to them as insurgents because the difference here is I think many of them are coming from outside. These are not, necessarily
foreign fighters.
Yeah, let me take a time out here, Webster. We'll come back and we'll talk about the possibility of war against Syria and the evidence, the mounting evidence, which seems to indicate it's these insurgents, or rebels, if you wish, but these insurgents, these outside forces fighting the Assad regime that are responsible for the chemical attack. Let's come back when we continue our conversation with Webster Tarpley here on The Conspiracy Show. Welcome back. Webster Tarpley is with us. The website, www.tarpley.net, TARPLEY.net, and a whole catalog of amazing books there for you, of course, including 9/11 Synthetic Terror, and which, as I said, is considered the Bible of the 9/11 Truth Movement, the unauthorized biography, George Bush, the unauthorized biography, now 20 years later, but still one of those cult classics that every truth seeker should have on his library shelf. Right now, we're talking about Syria, and let me ask you about these insurgents again. Who's funding them? Is it the Saudis, as we've been told?
Yes, they're funded by a group of these reactionary absolute monarchies, right? And these are the most benighted, medieval things that exist anywhere in the world, and they foment, mental states, ideologies, right? Salafism or al-Qaedaism or whatever it is around the world. In other words, the big fight was between Nasser and the Saudis, right, in the 60s and into the 70s, right? And Nasser with the progressive pan-Arab nationalism, Arab socialism, anti-imperialism.
Secularism.
secularism, right? And then the Saudis, of course, with this monarchy, right? There was actual human slavery in Saudi Arabia officially until 1963, and correspondents who have been to the Gulf tell me there's household slavery in these emirates and so forth today. So the Saudis pay, and then we have this little principality, Qatar, right? Qatar, which exerts an influence out of all proportion because it's had a kind of crazy emir. I have to compare him. If you know anything about French history, Philippe Égalité, right? The member of the French royal family who tried to join the revolution and ride that tiger and use it for his own purposes. Of course, he ended on the guillotine. But in the case of Qatar, the emir who was just sacked was the most adventurous and crazy guy, and he was into overthrowing all these countries. So Saudis, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, Kuwait gets into the act, sometimes Oman and others. So what do they do? There's a depression, right? So all these young men out of work. So they bring them in from Chechnya in southern Russia. They bring them in from the Taliban, right? The Taliban of Afghanistan, but especially the Pakistani Taliban are heavily represented. You can get people from Somalia who will work and kill people for very little money. You can get them from certainly Libya, right? A lot of the basic force were death squads that were used to overthrow Gaddafi in 2011. And once Gaddafi had been assassinated, they brought them over. There was actually an airlift, sea lift from the Benghazi, Derna, Tobruk area of Libya, and that's what Ambassador Stevens was doing there.
Right, ambassador
and
in quotes.
At a certain point, the Romney people said, "Look, he's in there. He's talking to them all the time. Let's surprise him. Let's have him get a nasty surprise, and we can use that as an October surprise against Obama." So it's a very, you could say, from Indonesia to Morocco, and from the southern edge of the Sahara certainly to far into Central Asia, right? They recruit people and they bring them in, right? And they train them in Jordan, and they work with Israeli and U.S. and NATO officers, so that it's not, and it never was a peaceful rebellion. I was in Syria in November 2011 with a French expert, Thierry Masson of the Réseau Voltaire of Paris, and we conducted seminars in two places. One in the city of Homs, right, the so-called birthplace of the rebellion, and then in a place on the coast called Banyas. Banyas is the next port to the north of Tartus, the Russian naval base. And in both of these places, it turned out that from the beginning, in other words, from the first demonstration, the absolute first demonstration, there were terrorist gunmen who were planted inside the crowds of peaceful protesters. Yeah, they thought they were, but didn't matter because they were provocateurs that had been seeded among their ranks who started shooting at the army. And it took quite a while for the army to shoot back. Indeed, Assad at the beginning had given an order, don't kill my people. I don't want the army killing people or shooting back. So they, in some cases, in this Banyas, there was a massacre of 50 or 75 members, draftees, right, young, scared kids, right, logistical troops, no combat training or anything much, but
just in it for the paycheck.
They were killed by these rebels because they were told you couldn't shoot back.
Wow. Now, in Homs, I remember you reporting on this, that there were these snipers, and they were being, the Western media was portraying these snipers as being government forces.
No, they weren't. As a matter of fact, I went into a neighborhood that was largely Alawite, not only Alawite, but they were Alawites. And I talked to people in a hospital there, and a woman doctor said, now I have to go home, and I'm afraid of getting hit by a sniper. They get up on the rooftops, and she also told the story of a friend of hers who had her child killed by a sniper shooting through the back of the car, and their only demand was, give us the Syrian army, give us tanks, give us helicopters that will kill these cowardly, bearded lunatics that go up on the roof and kill us. So this is artificial. That's the thing that people have to understand. This is absolutely not a spontaneous grassroots event. Now, of course, there were people who were agitating for more democracy. There were some very well-off people in the middle class that I met who wanted more democracy. There were also people like Marxists. I met a Marxist poet who said, Assad is a softie. We should really deal with these people, and so forth. But anyway, look, I think the thing that people have to understand is this, right? What are the strategic stakes? And then we can maybe look at these questions of proof. What Obama is asking for, if we read the resolution that he has sent to Congress, this is a blank check that goes all the way to World War III. This is not tailored, not limited. This is anything but a low-level, carefully calibrated event. The goal of all this is what? It is regime change in Syria. Absolutely. They're going to use cruise missiles to destroy, Assad's dwellings, the defense ministry, all these buildings that I've been in Damascus. Damascus, of course, the oldest continuously inhabited city in the world. How about that?
Yes.
The oldest city in the world, and the cradle of the oldest alphabet, right? Not pictograph, not characters in the Chinese way, but an actual alphabet. That's the Syrian. So it's going to be regime change through that. Remember, once you give them the resolution, that's it. They do what they want, right? That's what we learned in Libya. That's what Putin, to his great credit, Russia has learned. Don't authorize military action, because any limitations that are supposedly placed on the military action, they will not stand up. So the goal is regime change in Syria, then, or in that process, destroy Hezbollah, the force that restrains the Israelis from going wild in Lebanon and other places, and then quickly on to Iran. So this is already a major regional war. Syria, Hezbollah, Iran. And of course, look at Iran. 3 times bigger than Iraq in terms of population, probably 4 times in terms of area. This will not be easy. Boots on the ground will be required. I'm always interested to hear people like Obama say, "Well, we've planned this. It's going to be very limited." As von Clausewitz, right, the great German theoretician, writes, once you start with this, there's an animate object that responds to your attacks. And this can mean escalation. This can mean things that get very, very painful for you.
Well, this could very easily pull the Russians into this. Obviously,
yes,
Syria is...
That's exactly what I'd like to point to. That is the insanity of this resolution. We read, authorization for use of United States armed forces, and the president is authorized to use the armed forces of the United States as he wants to, anything he wants, in connection with the use of chemical weapons or other weapons of mass destruction in the Syrian conflict in order to prevent, deter the use or proliferation of such weapons or the transfer of weapons within, to, or from Syria, chemical, biological, or any other WMD. Now, what does that mean? If there's a Russian plane that's coming to Damascus, they can attack that plane. They can say, you've got precursor chemicals in there for sarin gas, or you've got a component for a missile that can deliver it. A Chinese plane coming in there, Chinese ships, Russian ships. This is a blank check for World War III. That is why this thing has got to be absolutely defeated, because Russia, China, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Iran is already more than enough. But then when you get to Russia and China, and insane as it sounds, this is how these lunatics think. And I have to point to this guy, Kerry, the Skull and Bones Society of Yale, right?
Yes.
This death cult.
The man who rolled over in the 2004 election after the fix was in Ohio and said nothing.
Yeah, I don't know. He might think that he's on his way to another run for presidency. Let's see what it is. But if we look at them, the presence of Skull and Bones is all the colossal tragedies of the United States and the world of the past, 75, 80 years. My research shows that Pearl Harbor, the debacle, was set up by Colonel Stimson of Skull and Bones with the help of Robert Lovett.
Stimson was the war secretary.
Stimson, and then he had his imps of Satan, who were McCloy and Lovett. So Stimson and Lovett were both from from Skull and Bones. They're the ones who withheld the intelligence and wrecked the defenses. Then we go on to Vietnam. Vietnam is the handiwork of Averell Harriman of Skull and Bones and the Bundy brothers, McGeorge Bundy and William Bundy, Skull and Bones.
All these Yale alumnists, right?
Yeah, but all Skull and Bones, not even Yale.
Right,
Skull
right.
and Bones. And then we get on to, of course, Bush the Elder, who brings you the first Gulf War, Skull and Bones, and then our dear friend George W. Bush, Skull and Bones, who brings you the Afghan War and the Iraq War. And when Kerry, I thought I was the only person in the world who noticed this. I wrote something, you can see it at tarpley.net for Press TV of Iran. This is a very, very dangerous person. And sure enough, this guy that you see, this hypocritical, the sallow face of hypocrisy that we see, the haughty Kerry, right? Supposedly the richest man in the Congress because of his wealthy wife, right?
The Heinz
Teresa
ketchup.
Heinz.
The Heinz ketchup fortunes, yes.
She married that money, but her origin is Salazar fascism and the Portuguese colonial world in, I believe, Mozambique. But Salazar fascism, take a look at that. It's one of the nastier variants. Anyway, the entire Syrian crisis goes back to June 5th, when the rebels were defeated in the city of Qusair. Right? The city was liberated by Syrian army, Hezbollah, and some Iranian advisors. On June 12th, right, less than a week later, or a week later, Kerry attempted to start the bombing. He was sitting in a principals committee meeting, right, of all the the secretaries of defense and CIA and Susan Rice and all these people. And he said, look, we got to start bombing Syria right now, because our friends, the death squads, are, reeling. They're being routed. We've got to get in there and save them, because otherwise, we won't have a secret army left in the Middle East. Now, he was stopped by General Dempsey of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who said, no, you don't have a plan, you don't know anything. And that is, I think, that was the convergence of Obama at that time and the Pentagon. But he tried a coup d'etat. In other words, he tried to do what Henry Kissinger did in 1973, which was take the U.S. to an all-out thermonuclear alert in the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East. Right? That was Kissinger. Or we've had other things. Right? Al Gore started bombing Serbia in 1999 solo. He didn't ask Clinton. They didn't ask Nixon, did he want to go to red alert? They just did it. And that's what Kerry was trying to do. So this is extremely dangerous character in that way. So they're determined to make this into a war. And by now, Kerry realizes that his job is at stake. I mean, this is just a sidelight, but it shows also a way that he can deal with it politically. What can we say of a Secretary of State who can't get the British to come along? He can't get Canada to come along. He can't get anybody to come along. Do you know how many people there are in the U.S. coalition right now?
1.
0. Well, yeah.
Well, France.
U.S.
What about France?
The French, this is very much up in the air. In other words, I'm talking about people who have made an ironclad, reliable commitment that they're coming, right? And they're coming with troops. In other words, they're going to have troops in harm's way. They're going to have some firepower, right? Not declarations of support, because you get those from Saudi Arabia, but people who are committed to it, right? There are lots of polls that the French say no. The French National Assembly has to vote. There might be ways to stop Hollande, right? He might he might back down. We'll see that probably on Wednesday of this week.
Listen, let's take a time out, Webster. When we come back, let's talk about the evidence, which seems to indicate perhaps it's not the Syrian insurgents, or perhaps it's not the Syrian regime of Bashar al-Assad that has the chemical weapons. It's the insurgents. All right, we'll take a time out. And back with Webster Tarpley here on The Conspiracy Show. Don't go away. And Webster Tarpley stays with us. His website, www.tarpley, TARPLEY.net. And we're talking about Syria. And once again, it seems that the United States is gearing up for another war in the Middle East. And Webster, many people may not remember, but back in May of this year, the UN did their own investigation over in Syria, and there was a UN investigation report that concluded it was the Syrian rebels that were in possession of chemical weapons, and that they were the ones using them on the citizens, not the Assad regime. Why isn't the Western media talking about that UN report?
Well, to ask such a question is to answer it. But here we are in the Western media, so let's talk about it. What you're referring to is Carla Del Ponte, who is a well-known UN bureaucrat, right? She's an official, and said this, right? That their finding was that the likelihood that they saw was that the rebels, right, the death squads, as I call them, were the ones using the chemical weapons. Now, there are a number of things on this that are relevant. The State Department position, inspired by Skull and Bones Kerry, who should have been fired already earlier this week, but the Kerry line is, these rebels don't have the capability, and they're unable to launch chemical weapons, which is ridiculous. If you get chemical weapons that have been weaponized, they show up as an artillery round. They show up as something that can be fired out of a gun. You don't have to mix anything. It's pre-packaged, right? It's a battlefield weapon. You can't bring test tubes and alembics out on the battlefield, right? You got to have it in a form that can be loaded into some gun or rocket launcher and then shot off. However, let's go back. Here we have articles from Reuters and other sources that tell us that at the end of May of this year, we had, and I guess the Reuters one is the most authoritative, Reuters reported on May 30th from Ankara, Turkish authorities have arrested 12 people and an amount of sarin nerve gas had been found, 2 kilograms. So, almost 5 pounds of nerve gas, sarin, had been found. And these were Syrian rebels linked to the Nusra Front, the al-qaeda terrorist gang, right, or part of one al-qaeda terrorist gang operating there. And they were in Turkey, and the Turkish authorities seized almost 5 pounds of sarin from them. Now, you should also know, remember all that brouhaha about the park in Turkey this past summer?
Yes.
The starting point of that was that all over southern Turkey, there had been months of demonstrations that were just ignored by these Western prostitutes, right? The winners, the many winners of the Goebbels Prize at ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and I'm sure others. The Goebbels Prize winners were not interested in the fact that all over southern Turkey, there had been demonstrations saying, get these terrorists out of here. We're sick of them. They steal. They threaten us. They're dirty. They destroy the tourist trade, and God knows what. From the city of Incirlik and from the port of Iskandarun, I believe, these people were making a nuisance of themselves. So there's another interesting event. Now, concerning this specific one, we have even more interesting things. This is an article that comes from something called the Mint Press, which is a website, and the article was up, and then it disappeared for a while. I guess it was hacked.
Is this the Dale Gavlak?
Gavlak.
Okay, let's take a time out. We'll come back, because I believe that he's a Middle East correspondent for the Associated Press as well.
I think he's a stringer, huh?
Okay.
A stringer, a part-time, that's the impression I get, or a former AP.
We'll talk about this. This is an important article because in this interview, the Syrian rebels appear to take responsibility for the chemical attack in Ghouta. But we'll discuss on the other side. Webster Tarpley here on The Conspiracy Show. Stay with us. Webster Tarpley stays with us for a few moments yet as we discuss Syria and the prospects for war over there. We were talking about this Associated Press stringer in the Middle East, Dale Gavlak, and he interviewed a number of doctors and residents in Ghouta and rebel fighters, in fact, and their families. And what did he find?
Well, the story is that there are many different groups, right, among the Syrian rebels. There are hundreds, maybe 1,000. And remember, they have killed each other on a number of occasions. There was one of the officials of the Free Syrian Army, a guy called, I think his name was Hamami, who was assassinated by the emir of the coastal region of the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Syria, Sham, as they say. So these emirates, these are warlords, and the emirates are like these little entities, right? The goal is you're going to have the NATO and the empire and the IMF over the world, no nation states, and only these little emirs in the Middle East. So anyway, they kill each other. They fight among themselves. So the idea that one of them would not gas some other one is wrong. But the Nusra and some others get paid directly from Saudi Arabia. And what they seem to have in this area called Ghouta, right, where this famous incident now is supposed to have occurred, was the people there report that a militant, a Saudi terrorist controller, I would say, he's a local terrorist official, but he's a Saudi, and he's obviously bringing money and other supplies. He brings tube-like structures and huge gas bottles, right? They have this, some people see, propane or some gas that you use for home purposes. Anyway, containers of that size, right? Tube-like structures and huge glass bottles. So kids, rebels, young fighters, one of the people in the village says, my son and 12 other rebels were given these tube-like structures and the huge glass bottles by this Saudi militant, and they put them in a tunnel, and my son and the others never came out, right? 12 of them dead. Now, what could it be? The story seems to say, well, they mishandled it, right? But maybe these things were timed to have things go off, right? So it's perfectly possible that the pattern, to the extent that there is one, is that the Saudi intelligence had delivered these charges, right, these containers loaded with nerve gas into the area, and then either by accident, which I don't think, or by coordinated, timer and detonator, had these things go off. And the idea in the area is that the prince, the head of Saudi intelligence is, of course, the infamous Saudi, the Prince Bandar, right? Bandar bin Sultan, right?
Or
Otherwise
Bandar Bush.
Bandar Bush,
yes.
right? The character he was here. But watch out for him, because this guy has no loyalties to anybody in the world. He will stab anybody in the back. There's a story circulating that he went to Putin, and he said, Putin, you've got to dump the Syrians and betray them. Otherwise, I'll make sure that my Chechen terrorists attack the Sochi Olympics. But if you play along with me, I'll make sure that there's no terrorism at your Olympic Games. So
and that was published in
the
Daily Telegraph. That story,
right? So you get the idea, right? So there's a perfectly credible account by somebody who's not crazy, right? He's not somebody who hears voices or believes in Martians or anything, but he's an AP stringer, and he's there and says this is what happened. So there are any number of other things, but we have now Kerry. Kerry says, "Oh, I have tissue samples, right? I have blood, urine, I have these things, hair." The problem with that is, what's the chain of custody? And where did these tissue samples come from? Like Kerry says this morning on his 5 Sunday blab shows, right? We've got this proof. Yeah, that's from the Nusra Brigade and al-qaeda forensics laboratory, right? That's essentially from the terrorists. So they probably have a way to doctor that with the help of Saudi Arabia.
Well, he has proof that there was a chemical attack. We all know there was a chemical attack. The question is, who's responsible?
Was, yeah.
Who's responsible? That's
right,
the only question.
That's the question. All right, so look, I would urge people to mobilize on this. In other words, I would not be fatalistic at all. I think the fact that no attack has occurred so far is a real victory, because it was going to occur probably around now, that is in the 24 hours now ending, or it might occur later this week when there's no moon, right? That's when they like to strike, right? When the cruise missiles cannot be seen even by ground observers, right? So there's no warning. So here's what it is. If you're in the United States, this is one of those rare occasions where it makes sense to send a letter, send an email, call the congressman and say, no war, not under any circumstances. And we don't care what the provisos are or the so-called limitations, because once the military action starts, they're going to do whatever the hell they want. They're not going to be bound by anything. Now, I suppose you're in Canada. What can you do? I would say get on the world social media, right? Get on the great sounding board of world public opinion. I would say is Twitter, and get on there. I was able to register for Twitter in about 5 minutes. If I can do that, anybody can. And what we just need is the gross volume of tweets, right? If you get on there, suppose you don't know, you can get on there anonymously, right? You don't have to reveal who you are, right? You don't have to worry about your job. Get on Twitter and then start putting stuff out. If you don't know what to put out, I recommend go to Webster G. Tarpley Twitter feed and start retweeting the ones of mine that you agree with, right? And if you follow those, you will also see, if you go to sites that say like Syria or Assad or, Obama, you'll find meritorious tweets that you can retweet. And I think before too long, you'll be doing your own, right? And I hope, I'm waiting. I can't wait for people to surpass me in quantity and quality. But
right. Find out who your MP is.
Go and read my tweets of the last week. You'll know just about everything.
Right. Find out who your MP is and direct it towards them, their office.
Well, Canada has already said no, and I would like to thank Canada, right, for that. As far as I could see, Harper had said no several days ago.
He has said no, and then we had John Baird, who is, I believe, the Minister for External Affairs, saying that we must take action. So my fear is that it is being sort of bandied about in the Prime Minister's office. Still, who knows? I mean, if the United States goes forward, the United States or Canada may, at some point jump in a lockstep, as they often do. But that, let's not wait for that to happen.
Well, in that case, of course, then you want to get the MPs informed that the Canadian public says absolutely not, under no circumstances, and there are no safeguards, so don't tell us about those.
Will Obama, the president has said he doesn't need, obviously he does need congressional approval according to the Constitution. In fact, he said when he was a senator, he would impeach President Bush if he didn't go to Congress.
Right. And let me just point, this is an interesting thing. The Republicans have learned the lesson of the last impeachment. The Republicans impeached Clinton before he attacked Serbia with the 3 months of bombing. They've learned something. The Republicans probably kicked themselves. They said, if we'd only waited until after the 3 months of bombing, like 6 months later, we could have impeached Clinton way back in the middle of 2009. So with Obama, the Republicans are in many ways madmen. I have nothing in common with them. They wish to impeach Clinton by any means they can get. So, And I think this is impeach Obama, right? That they think that they can do this. If he goes into this war, he will poison and destroy his own relation with his remaining supporters, right? Who have already been shaken by the great NSA revelations, right? Which are obviously very serious violations of law. So they think that they can get him later. The reason that Obama is going to Congress is that he wants insurance against impeachment. He takes it quite seriously. He can read the writing on the wall. Just before he made this decision, right, Senator Coburn, a supposedly respectable Republican senator from Oklahoma, started talking about impeachment, and we've had a number of other Republicans in the House.
Well, and if you go back, Biden, Hillary Clinton, and Obama all stated that they would have impeached George Bush if he didn't go to Congress to wage war.
So Obama takes this seriously because the Republicans hate Obama more, I would say, than they ever hated Clinton. And there were some very ugly motives in there, right? So that I am not going to be a part of that. But the thing that I think is feasible to do in the very short term is to stop this. In other words, if you looked last week, we have Skull and Bones Kerry on Monday with an insane foaming war tirade. Skull and Bones Kerry on Friday with another foaming war tirade. And in the middle, Obama makes these rather meek statements. Now, some of this is camouflage, of course, but the way is clear for Obama to say, Kerry, you're an incompetent, you're an absolute bungler, you can't get the UN, you can't get Ban Ki-moon, you can't get the Arab League, you can't get anybody. So you're fired, right? That's the Secretary of State is supposed to deliver the coalition. That's what James Baker did. That's what Colin Powell did. Who is this guy, right? He can't manage anything. The other person, of course, is the Viper, Susan Rice. And I regard her abrasive, loathsome personality as a positive force for peace, because anybody who has to deal with her begins to hate her and wants to deprive her of the things she wants. And the story we have here in Washington is on Thursday evening, as the British vote, and this is the finest hour of the British, absolutely, that they voted against this. Obama began to go wobbly. Kerry tried to firm him up on Friday afternoon with this lunatic tirade. Putin, of course, spoke for the first time on Friday morning with a very serious warning that's backed up by things that we don't know yet, but there are things. When Putin says something like that, there are threats, I think, in the background, or things that Russia might do. But then you could see that Obama came back from a 45-minute walk with Dennis McDonough, the chief of staff in the White House. It looks like Dennis McDonough has iced out Susan Rice. So McDonough is more concerned about Obama's personal political fortunes. Rice is concerned about her record as the new Ribbentrop, right? Setting up aggression all over the world. That's her bag. So it looks like Rice has been pushed aside, and McDonough's more influential. And that's when they said, we're going to go to Congress. In other words, we're going to stall and maybe hope for something to get out of this. The other thing, of course, is that the media here are at least grudgingly realizing that Obama has cut Kerry off at the knees, that he's hung him out to dry. And as we speak tonight, Kerry is hung out to dry, twisting slowly in the wind, as we say here.
All right, we're out of time, Webster. So let's hope there's a resounding no from Congress, and Obama heeds that.
Right, but it's the motto is always get active or get radioactive, and this is more applicable now than ever.
All right, Webster, thank you so much. Tarpley.net, the website.
Thank you.
All right, and my website, richardsyrett.com. Say hello on Twitter @RichardSyrett, and as always, follow the truth. A good friend of the program, it's been a while since we chatted, Webster Tarpley is an historian, a critic of American foreign policy, best known for his book, George Bush, The Unauthorized Biography. 1992, that came out. Tarpley was born in Pittsfield, Massachusetts in 1946. In 1966, he graduated summa cum laude from Princeton University, where he was elected to Phi Beta Kappa. He was a Fulbright scholar at the University of Turin, Italy, later teaching English at Cornell University. In 1970-1980, he appeared as a commentator for Teleradio Sole, a television station in Rome. And from 1984 to 1996, he was a correspondent let me get the dates right here. From 1984 to 1996, he was a correspondent in Washington. In 1997, he published an anthology entitled Against Oligarchy, Essays and Speeches, from 1970 to 1996. These books can be consulted on the internet at www.tarpley.net. His 9/11 Synthetic Terror is considered the Bible of the 9/11 Truth Movement. It sold over 20,000 copies. His two books on Obama are virtually the only critical ones in print from a progressive viewpoint. And most recently, he has published an e-book entitled Subverting Syria. Webster Tarpley, welcome once again to The Conspiracy Show. How are you?
Thank you very much, Richard. Subverting Syria is not really my book. I'm not sure where you got that. But what I did publish last year was one called Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America with polygamy, theocracy, and
my apologies.
And subversion.
I think that it was linked to a website that featured your books. My apologies. Okay. But we are here to talk about Syria.
Absolutely. And congratulations on your program and your network.
We're building it brick by brick. We're getting the word out there across America, Webster.
Great.
So let's back up. First of all, before we talk about this chemical attack, August 21st, let's talk about...
He's a figure very difficult to demonize because he's very personable. He's rather unassuming in some ways, but speaks a lot of English, right? Lived in London, was an eye doctor in London, has this rather presentable wife and so forth. But the main thing is that there's an establishment there which refuses to follow the dictates of U.S. imperialism. And this was the main crime of Gaddafi, right? You don't hear anything about the monsters of Saudi Arabia or the monsters of Qatar or the monsters of Bahrain, right? And those are absolute monarchs with no semblance of elections or anything else. But somehow they're spared, right? None of them is a madman. None of them is a monster. But I think in reality, those really are the monsters. So what we're left with then is, by a couple of years ago, the conclusion of U.S. imperialism with the British and many other NATO forces thrown in was that the World Economic Depression, which began in 2008, meant that it was on Nasser of Egypt. They were military, they were authoritarian to be sure, but they were anti-imperialist. They tried to have economic development, and they also tried to have this element of price subsidies and putting a floor under the poorest people. So they had a strong element of economic populism. Now, Syria under Hafez Assad, the elder, had I think was a much different proposition than what you had today. This was a country that was very much a dictatorship. The other problem you have, though, is you see that some of these countries have a tragic dilemma between dictatorship and absolute civil war and chaos, and I think that's a question that cannot be easily answered, but it certainly shouldn't be dodged. Anyway, as of the death of Hafez Assad around 2000, you have his son, who I believe is indeed a reformer, not in the way that would satisfy a lot of people, but certainly a reformer in the sense that it actually
out the Assad regime. What are your impressions? You've been to Syria.
Yes.
What are your impressions of Bashar al-Assad? Because I don't put him in he's a typical Middle Eastern ruler. He's a strong man to be sure, but I don't put him in the same camp as a Gaddafi or one of these madmen. He seems to me to be a very rational, reasoned human being.
Richard, I would be very cautious with this madman stuff because these terms are thrown around by Western leaders who are themselves open to question in terms of their sanity and their morality and so forth, right? We don't need to go much further than Bush the younger. I suppose we should go to Bush the elder. I've written about both of them. Gaddafi was somebody who built the largest water irrigation and drinking water project in the world, the great man-made river. And I think one of the reasons for invading Libya was to get a hold of that water, which is a very valuable commodity in the Middle East. What you have are these regimes that were modeled